Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second webinar discussion of our Fall 2022 Global China Research Colloquium, hosted by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. My name is Cecilia Springer. I'm the Assistant Director of the Global China Initiative at the Global Development Policy Center, and I also lead our research related to energy, climate, and global China. I want to introduce today's event in the context of Latin America's recent commodity supercycle, a synchronized and sustained price increase lasting more than 5 years. This supercycle was largely driven by a major influx in Chinese investment, finance, and demand for raw materials. Throughout that boom and the slump that followed, Amazon Basin countries sought to balance economic, social, and environmental priorities by strengthening and then relaxing their regulatory regimes. To what extent has the cooling of the China boom led to a region-wide relaxation of social and environmental standards? And where protections were relaxed, did those relaxations lead to greater, faster, or higher risk Chinese investment? These are some of the questions explored in a new working paper from the BRICS Policy Center of the Pontifícia Universidade Católica do Rio de Janeiro and the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. This paper that I'm very excited to introduce today explores the implications for managing environmental and social protections amid natural resource booms, protecting the cultural and biological diversity of the Amazon Basin, and promoting host country governance throughout the Belt and Road Initiative. Two of the authors of this paper join us today to discuss the findings. They are Paulo Esteves, coordinator of the Socio-Environmental Platform and the Global South Unit for Mediation at the BRICS Policy Center. Paulo is also a professor at the POC Rio Institute for International Relations. Next, we also have Rebecca Ray, senior academic researcher here at the Global Development Policy Center, and also the leader of our FAIR BRI research group, that's Forestry, Agriculture, Indigenous Rights, and the Belt and Road Initiative. Paulo and Rebecca will present for 30 minutes, at which point we will open up the discussion. Before turning over to the authors, I just want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording is immediately accessible. Please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom menu to ask your questions. And when you do so, also share your name and affiliation so we can get to know each other. So we'll take questions after Paulo and Rebecca's remarks, but please feel free to enter your questions at any time during the discussion. I'll be keeping an eye on them and moderating that session afterwards. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. And now over to you, Paulo and Becky.
Good morning. Can you hear me well? I think so, right? It's working. Okay, we never know. First, let me express my gratitude to the Global Development Policy Center at the Boston University, and particularly to Rebecca Ray for her leadership in this project and her kindness, particularly with regards of our deliveries during this entire process. Thank you very much, Becky. I think your leadership was enlightening and made possible this paper. As Cecilia mentioned before, what we were trying to understand within this paper was the relationship between social environmental protection regulation in the Amazon Basin and Chinese investments. And our point of departure, I think, Becky can correct if I'm wrong, but at least my point of departure in this endeavor was this commonsensical statement that Chinese investments very often challenge or weakening social environmental protection. And what the finds in this study may show is that this is highly a mythical or a political statement rather than an empirically verified statement. So our research questions, our point of departure was based in 3 research questions, which are the following. During and after South America's China boom in commodity investment during this period from 2002 and 2011, The countries in the Amazon Basin, and we are working with 4 countries where the Chinese investments are concentrated: Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru. Did these countries changed shift their social environmental protection in order to attract more investments in line with export prices? Second, did Chinese investments in the Amazon Basin grow after protections were relaxed, particularly after 2014, or were newer investments expedited? And third, did the environmental and social risk profile of Chinese investments in the Amazon Basin changed after the protections, after the relaxation of these protections? The next slide, please, Becky. The findings were, regarding to the question 1, on the relationship between the China boom and the shifts in the social environmental protection with regards to the export prices, our findings was yes, the countries in the region strengthened and then relaxed their socio-ecological, social environmental protections in line with commodity prices. But no, the relaxing did not prolong the China boom. Even relaxing the social environmental protection, these countries failed in attracting new investments from China or expedite Chinese projects already announced in the Amazon and the Amazon Basin. And finally, with regard of the environmental and social risk profile of Chinese investments, no, the answer is no. The socio-ecological risk profile of Chinese investments did not change significantly after the changes in the social environmental protections regulations in the region. Next slide, please, Becky. So in terms of policy, our work was concentrated around what we are calling now the Observatório dos Sistemas Nacionais de Proteção Socioambiental na região amazônica, which is the map of social environmental protection in the Amazon Basin in 5 countries, 4 of which we are focusing on in this study. This map traces protection reforms across these 5 countries and 9 dimensions, following the World Bank Social Environmental Protection Framework issued in 2012. In this particular case, in this particular study, we focused in 3 dimensions: environmental licensing, forest and protected areas, and indigenous peoples and traditional the protection of indigenous peoples and traditional communities. And we classify every reform or every shift in social environmental regulation in 3 categories: baseline, strengthening social environmental protection, or relaxing, which is called in South America flexibilización. We compare that with export price deflator. We compare that with international export prices. Next slide, please, Becky. So what we found was what we could identify 3 different periods. The first period during the 90s, where the baseline for social environmental protection was established, mainly due to international norms that were being adopted at that particular time, particularly after the UN conference in Rio in 1992. The second period is the period where social environmental protection was strengthened in the region, following the boom of export prices, as you can see in the gray line in the region. So the blue columns here, they show the number of regulations enacted in these 5 countries during this period from 1998 to 2011, and as you can see, the social environmental protection in the region was significantly strengthened. When in 2011, in between 2011 and 2012, the commodity prices start to fall. What we can see in the region is the third period where social environmental protection regulations was weakened or relaxed in the four countries in the study. Next slide, please, Becky. And if we count the number of measures or the number of decrees or laws enacted in these countries, what we are going to see is that in the period from 2012 to 2019, we have a significant process of relaxation of social environmental protection, which we are going to see did not necessarily correspond to a more significant number of investments from China in the region. So Becky, you have the floor for the next section. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paulo. I'll be looking at what happened in the wake of the relaxation of environmental and social standards. We're drawing from both greenfield, new foreign direct investment by China in the Amazon basin, as well as mergers and acquisitions, the purchase of existing projects, and sovereign policy bank loans to these countries for projects in the Amazon basin. So a wide definition of investment to capture the variety of approaches to the China boom in the region. We gathered these from across all of the databases that our peers and we ourselves have been tracking over this time, verified the geolocation, the precise spatial footprint of each of these projects, as well as their date of both announcement and the actual commencement. In other words, the groundbreaking, if it's a new project, or the final purchase date, if it's a merger or acquisition, to understand where these projects are and how long it took them to come to fruition. In all, we found 42 projects announced, about $30 billion, with 118 different unique geographic sites associated with them, because many projects have multiple sites. For example, when PetroChina bought Petrobras's oil assets in Peru, those were multiple oil sites, and they then expanded to even more oil fields. So many individual geographic sites make up this portfolio. What do we see in terms of the trends of investment over time? Here on the left, we see the number of investments, and on the right, we see the total size of investments in the billions of US dollars. As I said, this is $30 billion in total that we tracked. And you can see here on the number of investments increasing, both projects announced and project begun, until 2011, until those export prices peak. And then a sharp decline in the years following. And this is where we start seeing the environmental and social protections be relaxed. But over here in the size of investments, we can see we don't particularly see a rebound in the amount of money invested, except for 2013 and 2014, which is almost entirely comprised of just two deals, which comprise almost the entirety of these 2 years portfolio. Each of these two deals came in 2 packages each, for a total of 4 deals in total. First, as I mentioned, PetroChina's purchase of those oil blocks in Peru, and then the expansion. And then simultaneously, we see China Minmetals Group purchase and then expand the Las Bambas copper mine in Peru also. That comprises almost the entirety. So we do not see an overall rebound in investment to these earlier levels. We just see a few projects able to go through after those protections were relaxed. When it comes time to look at the time factor, how long it took to go from announcement to commencement of the project, this gets at the underlying motivation of expediting projects that are in the portfolio. Here we have the average time from announcement to commencement in months over this time period. We do not see that this decreased during the time period. In fact, we see that it rebounded after protections were relaxed. We do not see that the process is streamlined or sped up, but actually slows down. And it's worth pointing out here that the longest duration of project pipelines happen not in the largest projects. This isn't just a function of very large projects coming through the pipeline. In fact, the projects that took the longest to come to commencement are highway projects in Bolivia. They're not these oil and mining projects in Peru. So this is entirely separate from the function of how big the projects are coming through. So in this way, we do not see that the relaxation of safeguards necessarily prolonged the boom or expedited approval for those projects that were in pipeline. Regarding the environmental and social profile, even if projects didn't particularly speed up or increase in size, they may still have become riskier. And so we look at the environmental and social profile of this portfolio of investment. As I said, there's 118 distinct geographic project sites that we traced. You can see them mapped here in different colors based on their sector. As you can see, some are points, some are lines, for example, this highway project in Bolivia, and some are polygons, many of which are too small to display here, and so they're displayed as points as well. Polygons can indicate things like oil fields or reservoirs for dams. And again, these are three types of investment: greenfield investments, mergers and acquisitions, and direct policy bank financing for government projects in the Amazon. We look at their environmental and social risk profile through three different ways. I'm not going to get into the math here, although I'd be happy to do so in the Q&A period. But suffice to say, we look at three dimensions. First, we look at the risks to indigenous lands using an index that takes into account not only the proximity of a project to indigenous territory, but also the existing human footprint in that region, weighing more heavily projects that are the first formal sector economic activity to open up that space. Risk to biodiversity. This function takes into account how much of a threatened species territory, a threatened species habitat is covered by a project, weighted by how rare that species is. And then finally, the relative change in tree cover, which asks whether the decline in tree cover around a project, whether that accelerated after the project broke ground, or whether that decelerated or stayed roughly the same. A value much higher than 1 is going to indicate an increase in deforestation. A value of 1 would indicate nothing has particularly changed. We'll go through these one by one. First, looking at risks to indigenous lands, here we see by year the range, the variety of results for all of the projects that broke ground in a particular year. As you can see, the median value generally declined across the time period when environmental and social standards were being strengthened. But in 2014, we really see these outliers pop up. We don't see an across-the-board resurgence to these higher levels of risk, but we do see these outliers. And these outliers include those PetroChina purchases of those oil blocks. They also include China Three Gorges Corporation's development of the São Manuel Dam in the Brazilian Amazon. And that is, of course, in 2014, that year where we do see 1 year resurgence in big projects coming through. Looking at threatened species, this graph is a little more complicated than the last graph because there's different colors indicating different taxa, different groups of species that we're looking at here. Red indicates amphibians, orange are birds, green are freshwater fish, and blue are mammals. So each year has 4 different results bars in it showing the distribution of results of risks to that taxa in that year. And again, we see a similar trend. We see a general decline as those environmental and social standards are being strengthened. And then in 2015, actually, is where we see a resurgence of risk for that 1 year of rather extreme outliers, including here the Coca-Cola Sinclair hydroelectric dam in Ecuador, the power transmission lines associated with that. And then finally, the relative change in tree cover. As I said, 1 indicates no change in tree cover. Things essentially remained as they had been. And that is indicated with this red line going across the screen. Numbers higher than that indicate an acceleration of deforestation. Again, we don't see an aggregate across the board trend here after the protections were relaxed, except for this high risk year of 2014, where we see that São Manuel Dam in Brazil developed by the China Three Gorges Corporation. And in fact, the deforestation around that project was so high, we had to put this y-axis on a log scale in order for the results to show up. So what emerges from all of these results is that we don't see an overall increase in investment. We don't see an overall acceleration of investment, except for a few very large, very high risk projects that were allowed to go through, particularly in 2014. In fact, some of these 2014 projects received such significant social protests continuing to be ongoing today. And the reasons for those protests are outside of the scope of this analysis, but there's anecdotal evidence suggesting that those protests have slowed down future investment interests. In fact, there are other projects. As I said, not all of the projects in our portfolio have started yet. Some of them have not reached commencement yet, particularly projects that have been slowed because of civil society concern that the environmental and social risks haven't been adequately taken into account by the legal framework. This includes, for example, the Rositas hydroelectric dam in Bolivia and the Amazon waterway in Peru. And so the overall takeaway here is that reducing or relaxing or flexibilizing environmental and social standards in order to try to attract faster, more, or larger Chinese investment in this environmentally sensitive sector area, this socially diverse area, did not have its intended results. Instead, we see that maintaining those standards may be crucial to continuing to have a successful investment relationship. In general, we can generalize these findings for Belt and Road Initiative host countries, particularly those that are host to environmentally and socially sensitive areas, and those that are hoping to attract investment based on location-based assets. What that means are the natural resources that are being exploited in these investments are where they are and will continue to attract investors regardless of the short-term costs of meeting regulatory requirements. In those cases, there's policy space for governments to set and enforce the environmental and social standards that their citizens demand without concern that it's going to scare off that kind of investment. Thank you so much for listening. I really look forward to the question and answer session, which is always so rich in these webinars.
Thank you so much, Paulo and Becky. I would encourage all of the participants to please drop your questions into the Q&A box. I think that this research is quite timely. Yesterday in the US was Indigenous Peoples Day, and as you can see from the results, Becky and Paulo conducted an analysis of risks to Indigenous peoples' lands. At the same time, there are also various election cycles in the countries covered in this study, namely Brazil. And I think the policy implications will be very important to discuss. So please do drop in your questions. I'll go ahead and take the moderator's privilege to start with a question about the concept of resource nationalism, which is part of the framing of your paper. And I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit first about the relationship between resource nationalism and environmental policy in the Amazon Basin countries, and if there are any lessons learned that may be applicable to the region more broadly, where other states are seeking to control their domestic natural resources, and China and other foreign investors are also continuing to be involved in seeking to access resources and markets. So let's start with that question about resource nationalism. Thanks.
Thanks, Cecilia. I can take a brief turn with this, and then I'd like to turn it over to Paulo Esteves as a political scientist and international relations professor. You may have more insight than I do. Resource nationalism is a term we hear scholars use broadly to discuss the attitude of governments during this time to the goal of making sure that these natural resources, the exploitation of these natural resources, furthers national development goals, making sure that the revenues from them, the investments from them, are benefiting their communities in general and their local economies. And here's where we see those protections gather steam during that time. Now, the literature discusses two approaches to this. One of them is more open, more seeking foreign investment in those commodities. And that's where we see the incorporation of the greenfield and the mergers and acquisitions, foreign direct investments in our portfolio of projects. The other approach is referred to by scholars as closed resource nationalism, wanting a larger role for state-owned enterprises and taking direct sovereign finance to help fuel that expansion. And so that's why we also include policy bank loans in this broad definition of investment to capture both approaches to resource nationalism. And I think that our results broadly indicate that the goals of wanting to ensure that national governments can maximize the benefits and minimize the risks of commodity booms to their communities and to their national economies is borne out by the evidence that there's policy space to enact the regulations that you see fit, that your citizens are demanding in order to meet those goals. The only concern is that when prices cool, that may create an incentive to relax those protections that have been hard fought and hard won in order to try to accelerate the commodity investment that has become the backbone and the driver of that development strategy. But I'd like to turn it over to Paulo as a political scientist and international relations expert for your opinion on it.
Thank you, Becky. I don't know if I have much to say about this. I think your account was pretty broad and comprehensive. The only thing we can perhaps project, not with regards to this study particularly, or to this overlook at the past, is perhaps that the resource nationalism policies are in crisis now, particularly because the fact that you highlighted, Becky, let's say the dependence of these policies upon international prices, and how during a period where international prices drop, they are, from one side, they are forced to relax, or they are compelled to relax social environmental protection, and from the other side, we can also think that while they are dropping, or they are flexibilizing, relaxing social environmental protection, they are also getting public support for these policies. So in one way, what we are seeing in these countries in the region, as Cecilia said, in this new cycle of elections, is a kind of a referendum or some kind of a plebiscite, that makes sense in English, a public referendum about these policies. And while we had the first round of elections 4 years ago or 5 years ago, where the relaxing policies were broadly supported in the region, what we are seeing now perhaps is a change in these policies, and a change perhaps in the model supported by resource nationalism, in the debate about alternatives to this model, alternatives that would include, let's say, the creation of environmental services in the region, in these territories, and other options for the development of the territories themselves, but not necessarily to support the national development through the extraction of commodities in these territories. Even though we are still seeing some kind of a push coming from the relaxation, I think this new cycle brings to the fore precisely this development model.
Great, thank you, Paulo and Becky. We have a few questions from the audience, so I'll just take a cluster. And I think the first couple are really digging a little bit deeper into the drivers of some of your findings and the methodology. So the first question is from Barbara Fraser, a journalist in Peru. And Barbara asks, did you look at the level of protection that the indigenous territories had? For example, were they titled or demarcated, demarcation and process, etc.? And if you did look at these distinctions, did you see a difference in risk to those territories? having some familiarity with this study as it progressed, maybe you could also talk about kind of data availability if this specific categorizations were not explored in the study, data availability, especially for understanding impacts to indigenous lands. And then next we have a question from Martin Pinheiro, who is Director for Agriculture at the Argentine Council for Foreign Relations. And Martin asks about the actors driving implementation for these projects. Are China-funded projects executed by local public agencies, the private sector, or Chinese subsidiaries? And so I'll stop there and we can collect some more questions.
That's great. I can answer the first one, or at least partially answer the first one and partially answer the second, and then turn it over for Paulo for your considerations if you'd like. For global replicability of this approach, we're relying on maps of indigenous territories that are global in scope rather than nationally defined. And in order to do that, we unfortunately cannot take into account the level of titling of each individual territory. As Latin Americanists in the room know, that's an area of significant contention in the region. However, globally, Latin America is far ahead of the curve in demarcating and recognizing and titling indigenous lands. When we look at global data sets of indigenous territories, those outside of Latin America are very often indicated merely by an approximate point, particularly the case in Southeast Asia. There's really only one global data set of indigenous territories that is able to be compared and replicated in different regions around the world. And we're hoping that this work can support comparable studies in other regions that have seen similar, or are seeing now, similar commodity booms and similar changes in environmental and social standards. Here I'm thinking about Indonesia, which is facing the potential of the end of its coal boom as the world shifts away from coal-based energy, and its omnibus law, which has gone significant distance to deregulate coal investments in order to try to expedite those. We see similar trends around the world in environmentally and socially sensitive areas, and we hope that our work can inform not just Latin Americanists, but also our peers in other regions. And so unfortunately, we weren't able to take into account that level of detail about demarcation of indigenous territories in Latin America because that data is simply not available elsewhere. But Barbara, thank you so much for that question. It's great that you're on the call with us today. Regarding the actors involved in Chinese finance projects, this does vary. However, the Export-Import Bank of China, which is the predominant lender in the region, is an export credit agency, which means its purpose is to lend to governments to use its services and its products, just like the US Export-Import Bank, and just like Brazil's National Development Bank did for many years, lending to its neighbors to use Brazil's champion in infrastructure, Odebrecht. And so by definition, I'll leave more discussion of that to you, Paulo. But by definition, that approach to lending relies on the lender's contractors. The US does it, Brazil does it, every country that has a development bank uses this approach. And so by and large, the infrastructure built with these lenders are using Chinese contractors because that is the purpose of export credit agencies around the world, Europe's, North America's, Brazil's, Japan's, etc. Paulo, I'd love to give you a chance to explain the gesture that you just made, or any other additions you'd like to make.
I won't touch the Brazilian National Development Bank and its contractors. On the question of indigenous territories, Barbara made. I think as Becky said, we could not follow the demarcation per se. What we did get in our map. In our map of regulation in the region was the changes in the not in the process of demarcation, but in the change in the rules of demarcation, and that was we had a very hot debate in Brazil, which is being discussed in the Supreme Court still. We don't have a final decision about that. And what we saw in the other countries in the region was some, not in demarcation per se, but some breaches in the let's say in the type of activities that are allowed within indigenous territories. So we have small breaches in all countries allowing some kind of extractive activities in the indigenous territories all over the place. This is also a common trend in Brazil as well. The other thing about Martin's question, Becky was addressing the question of financial operations mediated by development banks or ex-im banks. There are some cases also, and this is particularly the case of Brazil, where you have direct investments from state-owned enterprises, and what they are doing is basically buying some companies in the country and moving with these national companies which are internationalized in that sense. In the case of Brazilian energy grid is I think it's a compelling case about this process.
Great, thank you both. And we have another round of questions here. So from colleagues at Boston University. So first from Zara Albright, who is in the political science department here and also a fellow with our Global China Initiative. Zara asks, can you talk a little bit more about how and why you settled on the definitions and equations used for your risk profile? Are these new? Have they been used by other organizations? And do you think this is how governments and affected communities also define themselves and understand risk? Zara also asks if there's kind of, if there could be a race to the top in terms of ESG standards to attract more investment. Was the flexibilization or relaxation trend countries trying to make it easier for investors? We also have a question from Natalia Escobar Pemberti, a lecturer at the Pardee School in Latin American Politics and Environment and Development. And Natalia asks, how do you see these policies for resource nationalism to be compatible with the strategies of some of the new governments for the recommodification of their economies? And so how can we make sure that this doesn't lead to more relaxation, even if not for foreign investors? And I think this relates to a second question from Martin about how do you see policies in regards to China potentially changing under a Lula government in Brazil? So, you know, if I can encourage the authors to project a little bit about environmental regulations and then foreign investment regulations under some different election scenarios.
Why don't we let Paulo speak first this time, since I've had the last two rounds first.
Okay, let me start with the last question about Lula government in China and this whole model of resource nationalism. First, the first thing to say is we are 3 weeks away from the elections, and the elections are far from over. The numbers are not quite, let's say, they're not quite, I cannot be optimistic about these elections, actually. The numbers coming from the polls are quite, let's say, dangerous in a way. But Bolsonaro's rejection is dropping a lot. So there's a space for him to grow and perhaps to win the election. So the whole point here is we are not sure about this, but what we can understand, as I said, is that in this particular election, I think the model of a resource nationalism, which depends, which has a kind of a hook on international prices, is being discussed, even though the debate is not in the front page of the newspapers, and it's not in the highlights of newspapers. But I think under the whole the whole debate, under the whole nasty debate that we are having in the newspapers, you can find some kind of a referendum around this development model, and it is interesting to see how Lula is moving towards a project that even though has some kind of support on the idea of commodity extraction, tries to overcome this, or tries to create alternatives to this model when discussing. First, there is one statement that Lula made that we should be aware. He said that in the case of the Amazon belongs to Brazil and also belongs to the world. The world would be affected by the actions that the Brazilian government adopt towards the Amazon, and the process of development should be discussed taking into account the needs of the Brazilian needs, but also the world needs with regards to biodiversity and climate stability. So this is a change in his own position and the position he adopted 15 years ago. And following this new position, I think Lula is open to discuss alternatives of development in the Amazon region, which is not based only and uniquely in the extraction of commodities in the region, and that is. It tries to create alternatives in terms of services and in terms of manufacture activities to the region, which are not completely dependent on the commodity extraction and commodity prices in the international market. I would leave it there, Becky. Just to with regards to Zara's question about the race to the top or race to the bottom. Actually, we started discussing this, right, Becky? We started discussing the possibility of treating this as a race to the bottom, and we did not completely discard this, but to the point we reached, I think, correct if I'm wrong, Becky, is that there is no competition among these agents. We could not find a competitive dynamic that would force for relaxation of national socio-environmental protection. Rather, these countries are trying to. These countries are following the international prices. They are trying to attract investments, but it was impossible to identify this competitive dynamic that is a characteristic or that features the race to the bottom.
Thanks, Paulo. I really like your question, Zara, in the juxtaposition of the idea of a race to the bottom and a race to the top. We're in an interesting moment in time regarding the development finance institutions in the region. Part of their mandate is development of both hard infrastructure, such as roads and power, as well as soft infrastructure, such as institutional capacity. We're at a moment of transition in the leadership of regional and global development banks. Of course, we're at a moment of transition of the Inter-American Development Bank's leadership, as the past president has just been forced out and a new president is, discussions are ongoing about who the new president might be. The names that have been floated so far are very encouraging to me as a Latin American scholar and as a scholar of development, in that they have a vision. They both of the names that I've seen floated so far are individuals who have visions for regional economic and sustainable development, and that speaks to the potential for really re-harnessing that mandate of that regional development finance institution. And of course, the World Bank, we currently see controversy surrounding the fact that the current president of the institution cannot say publicly that he believes in climate change. It remains to be seen whether this will lead to a broader scandal whether or not he'll be replaced, but there's certainly a moment of attention on the role of the World Bank in coordinating both hard and soft investments to face our common challenge of climate change. And it's my hope that any changes that happen in the wake of these scandals can lead these institutions to further embrace their traditional role in climate finance, both hard infrastructure for climate change mitigation and adaptation, and soft infrastructure investment in institutional capacity building. But that kind of harmonization or mutual recognition, mutual collaboration of these sometimes very young environment ministries, culture ministries, labor ministries among each other is an area of great potential at this moment as we stand at a juncture in leadership of regional cooperative and financing agencies. Regarding your question about the math, we did in fact try very much to ground the math in the areas that are most important in political dialogue. So in acceleration or slowing of deforestation is clearly a variable that's talked about a lot. For example, the funding and then the end of funding of the Amazon Fund in Brazil lived and died based on increases and deceleration of Amazon deforestation. And so that is something that we struggled with how best to reflect it in the map, but we knew that that was an area that we definitely wanted to explore. And of course, encroaching upon Indigenous territories or bringing for the first time formal sector economic activity into the range of Indigenous territories is of course hugely politically important. It's also clearly important from a risk management perspective. When it comes to biodiversity, we looked for, and here I need to praise Yashong Ma, our colleague and fellow who developed these formulas, really has done stellar work in finding the appropriate way to measure these impacts and risks, taking into account both the amount of a species range that's taken into account, that's covered by a project, as well as the rarity of that species, allows us to essentially quantify and turn into an index the importance of a project in altering the destiny of endangered species in the area. This is our attempt to get at endangered and threatened, what's happening to vulnerable and endangered species, and the risks that the projects pose to them. That's something that we can discuss in casual parlance. It's something that can be discussed in the press or in political dialogue. This was our attempt to find an index. Now, all of these indices are used broadly in the literature, except for we had to figure out the best way to measure acceleration in tree cover change. That's a concept that's measured in many, many studies that look at this kind of risk. But this particular index, we took care to make sure that it was well calibrated for what we were looking at in this particular region. But yes, we tried very much to both ground it in the political discussions as well as in the scholarly literature. Thanks for that question.
Great, thank you. And just one last quick round of questions for our authors. First from Tarala Moses, our database manager here at the Global China Initiative. And Tarala asks, were there any differences in how foreign direct investment versus policy bank financing from China's policy banks responded to the relaxed environmental and social standards? And so if you could share, whether sort of anecdotally or from your data about this breakdown between FDI and policy bank finance from China. And then lastly, as the moderator, I would just love if the authors could summarize kind of their one key takeaway or a finding that they didn't get to cover today for the audience. Yeah, thank you.
Paulo, would you like to start again? I can, it's fine.
Okay. Okay, I can start. Again, Becky, correct if I'm wrong. This is your turf. I don't see many differences between FDI versus policy bank financing with regards to environmental and social protection standards. With regard on the takeaways, I think there are two things that actually three issues or three questions that remain to be seen. And these are my takeaways. My takeaways are basically what we have to work from now on to further develop this study. The first one from our particular side is to try to include in this map of a social environmental protection issues related to how these policies or how these regulations are being enforced, how policies are being adopted in the region. Because one thing that we discovered is a progressive and consistent work of these governments in let's say institutionally weaken social environmental protection. So one thing that we have to map is resources available, personnel available, decisions of the courts regarding social environmental protection, and so on and so forth, to see how these regulations and how these regulations are being enforced, and how the policies are being actually enacted by these governments. So one thing is related to go beyond regulation. One dimension, and the second dimension, and this is an important takeaway, I guess, is that we have learned that relaxation do not attract more Chinese investment to the region. This is the main takeaway. But the question that remains to be seen is whether or not relaxation is attracting other investments from other regions beyond China, and this would be very interesting to see whether this process of relaxation is actually attracting Western investments, and this is particularly interesting if we take into account that this entire narrative that Chinese investments are against or are at odds with strengthening of social protection is a narrative created in the West. And let's see if they are actually following what they are saying, if they are putting their money where their mouth is. So their mouths are, sorry. So that's the second question, and the third question is related precisely is related to the development model adopted in the region, whether or not this region can actually overcome and create alternatives to this model of resource nationalism or a model of development based on resource extraction and based on resource the trade of commodities in the international market. Whether or not this region, particularly as Cecilia said, and I think Cecilia's point in the beginning was quite to the point, quite accurate. Whether or not this new election cycle will be able to create or to establish in the region new development models that would allow the region to protect social environmental protect the rights of the people and the rights of nature, if you wish, and at the same time provide a development alternative to their citizens.
Thanks. I'll start with the technical and then go broader. To Terrell's question about difference in actors, we don't see much of a difference. When we think about, just as an example, I mentioned that there are a few projects that were announced but haven't had ground broken yet, in part because civil society has mobilized against them out of concerns that the social and environmental impacts aren't being fully taken into account by the legal process. And those include both a direct investment, the Hidrovia Amazonica, the Amazon waterway in the northern Amazon of Peru, and the Rositas hydroelectric dam, which was to be, and it is still, although it is currently in limbo, Chinese policy bank financed, but Bolivian government owned hydropower plant on the edge of the Amazon basin in Bolivia. We see both kinds of projects falling into this trap because both kinds of projects are the product of a joint management between national governments, the contractors who pursue the projects, and the eventual owners, whether those eventual owners are foreign or domestic. And so we don't actually see, we thought there might be a significant difference, but we don't actually see one, which means that largely we can consider this portfolio of projects together as a unit and think about both kinds of resource nationalism, both the more open to investment kind and the more closed kind that prefers to have local government ownership of projects. We can consider all of them jointly when it comes to management, which helps us overcome some of the differences in political approaches across the region and think about joint challenges that all of these governments face, regardless of whether they pursue a more open or closed strategy towards harnessing their natural resources. And then secondly, if there's a larger point that I'd like to make that I don't think perhaps we got to discuss as much as I would like to, it's that the common idea that environmental and social protections must be weighed against economic benefit, and that policymakers have to choose between these priorities or find equilibrium or balance is a false dichotomy. That without environmental and social protections, successful investment regimes cannot be pursued, at least when we are talking about natural resource-based investments, in part because the motivation of the investor is predominantly driven by the location of the asset that they're hoping to develop. That's going to be where it is, regardless of the regulatory regime surrounding it. And the time horizon for the development of these assets is in the decades, right? The lives of mines or oil wells are measured in decades. Therefore, the short-term regulatory cost that investors face is relatively small across the entire length of an investment. This is particularly important as the region looks towards the next generation of natural resources that will be so important. Decarbonizing the energy grids of the world, adopting renewable energy, that's going to rely on greater development of lithium. It's going to rely on greater development of copper. It's going to rely on greater development of rare earth minerals, and even in Ecuador, balsa wood, which is a necessary component of wind turbine blades. As the region looks towards this next generation, being able to establish that in the last generation, environmental and social concerns were not a brake or a hamper on economic development, but actually a necessary foundation of economic development, is, I think, an important step in being able to plan for sustainable and inclusive approaches to developing these resources that, frankly, will be crucial in energy decarbonization around the world. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much to Paulo and Becky for sharing their thoughts with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined the discussion. And we had a really great Q&A. So this colloquium has been recorded on YouTube, and we will share the link in the chat. And just before you go, please be sure to join us next month for the next installment of our Global China Research Colloquium, where we'll be discussing some of the trends in diversifying the Belt and Road Initiative, the rise specifically of the rise of China's overseas development investment funds. What is an overseas development investment fund? Well, you'll have to come back next month to find out. So if you did register for this session, you'll also be signed up for the rest of the series and receive the link for the webinar. To receive updates on our publications and events, you can subscribe to our Global China Initiative newsletter, and the link will also be in the chat. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you all